Hey, Three Crosses family, welcome back to the podcast. We are in the middle of our Revelation series. We are talking through Revelation chapter 6 all the way to the beginning of Revelation chapter 8. We're looking at the 7 seals of this magnificent scroll. And so we have a great conversation in store. With that, let's go deeper. Joining us to talk about the 7 seals on the scroll that is yet to be opened, Pastor Danny Strange. Pastor Danny, how you doing with Revelation so far? This is a big chunk of text.
Yeah, this is when it starts to get good and bad. So I can't wait to talk about it more.
Man, it's been so fun walking through this Revelation series. If you didn't check out our Rapture video, feel free to check that out because I think that's very informative if you're looking for that question to be answered. But right now, we're going to start in Revelation chapter 6. We got a lot to go through, including 7 different seals. So we're just going to unpack each one of them, starting with verse 1. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Okay, so I jumped into the text right away. So I know in the previous episodes, since I know we took a couple weeks off here, we ended Act 1 and it came to a great conclusion. So help us remember where we came from and then help us begin to understand what is going on with the popping of the first seal. And we see this white horse sent out with a crown, a conqueror bent on conquering.
Yeah, so where we've been so far is that John has had 2 different distinctions of Jesus. The first is in Revelation 1 and 2, and John sees this image before him standing amongst the lampstands. He gets the message for the 7 churches. He gives us this message, so then we get to go the 7 letters to the 7 churches. And then we see this idea that the angel says, hey, come and I'll show you what must take place after this. And now he's in the throne room of God. And in the throne room of God, John sees another vision, which is the King of Kings on his throne, and then this lamb that was slain standing in the center of the throne. And off to the side, John looks and sees this seal, which brings us into Act 2. He sees the scroll with 7 seals on it, which brings us into Act 2 of Revelation, where now we're anticipating what's on this scroll. What are the words of this scroll? And so what you and I are about to talk about is not actually the words on the scroll. We've got these 7 seals holding the scroll closed, like 7 padlocks on a briefcase. And it's almost like every time a different padlock is opened, a new realm of chaos is broken here on planet Earth. And so these next few chapters, we really just get to hear, it's almost like boom, 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 boom. These 7 seals pop from the scroll, which precede it being opened and read. And so it's the beginning of the end. And so the first seal is popped open.
The white horse.
And a white horse emerges, which sounds a lot like Jesus, right? Jesus shows up later on a horse with a sword and a robe dipped in blood. We see this conquering king, and it's this moment of like, yeah, all right, this is going to be really good. But then these other horses come. It's like, oh no, like this crew that's following the white horse is bringing some chaos onto the earth.
So you said something really important there, because a lot of people think that this white horse could actually be Jesus. Do we think that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly who believes what, so I don't know who I'm about to make mad, but this white horse looks a lot like Jesus, right? There's a crown. It's dressed in white. It looks like this rider dipped in blood. But at the same time, we get a picture. The lamb is the one opening the scroll. So Jesus is in the room. We also get a picture so far that Jesus is this suffering lamb with power.
Not bent on conquest sort of thing.
Like there's a tension that doesn't seem to exist in this horse.
Right.
And then also when the other 3 horses emerge right here, you also start to realize, oh, maybe this is a different type of being that's connected kind of in this realm of pestilence and violence, these things we'll talk about. So yeah, either this is Jesus leading these other 3 horses, or these are 4 horses symbolizing, right, how victory is coming. So I don't know. Did I hit all of it?
I think the intentional wordplay here is that this horse looks a lot like Jesus. And if it is Jesus, I hope that he's not associated with these other 3 horses, because it gets pretty bad. But
It's like, Jesus is here. Wait, who's with him? Oh, no.
I think there's something to be said about the appearance of this horse, because it looks an awful lot like a Jesus figure. And perhaps a lot of people have drawn the connection. Maybe this is like the Antichrist that's leading these different charges or whatnot, because it looks so much like Jesus. But yeah, just something to keep in mind there as we walk through these things, because we're gonna walk through them one by one, and then I want to ask a question that's going to zoom out and see all these other ones. But the second one here, when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. The red horse, the second seal, the second living creature saying, "Come," and then many people killing each other with a large sword. Talk to us about the imagery going on with this red horse.
First thing we see is it's almost identical to the first story, right? There's a seal, there's a trumpet sound, another living being says, "Come," and then a new type of horse, a different color. And it's interesting because on one hand, it's violence and destruction, but it also feels a little bit like a removal of a lack of violence and destruction, right? It's almost like people start killing each other
because that red horse comes.
Because the red horse comes. You don't. It's not the horse starts killing people. It's the red horse does something, and his arrival turns people against each other, which again matches up with Jesus' teachings on the end times in his earthly ministry when he talks about nation rising up against nation, warring against warring. This is not God directly bringing his sword to planet Earth. It almost feels like something is being removed that causes people to turn against each other. And it feels like the world is starting to fall apart.
Well, I think it's fascinating that you brought that up, because what we've been talking about is reading this through a first century lens as well. And that imagery of a sword and the talk of peace reminds me of the Pax Romana, like the peace of Rome, all of a sudden being taken away. And this imagery of this sword comes from, the one who is like a high military official, or even like during the empire, it says a sword was worn exclusively by the emperor. So I think this is like, whoa, like this rider is coming in and has the power to like overturn what the system has been protecting this whole time. So I think that's really interesting to think about in terms of the imagery.
Well, and I think too, if we look at our own day, it's funny, if you're living in the first century, it's like, oh no, he's talking about the Pax Romana ending and this, the safety net of this world is just if it breaks, the whole thing breaks. We still think of those types of things, right? If this was today, we're getting this image. It's like we start getting images of like a Russian-Ukrainian conflict and what happens if the world starts turning against each other. We think about nuclear, kind of Cold War level or even today level arms race stuff, where what happens if something in diplomacy breaks down and North Korea starts sending weapons, or China keeps testing more weapons, or what happens if the Iran nuclear program picks up steam and we're not able to kind of hold back the fury of that. And if we remove what we're doing, or Israel and Palestine, all of these different conflicts that when we look at America as the center of the world, which is not the center of the world, but us as Americans reading it, if we're picturing our own role in the world, we see ourselves almost as some of these intermediaries in these different countries. And what happens if politics change in America, or diplomacy changes in America, or the tide changes in America, and all of a sudden this war expands to a less than regional level, to a nuclear level, to a global level. And so I think even today, when we think about violence, sometimes we think about violence through the lens of a removal of peace, and now boom, World War III emerges. So we use those same images today. Like, man, if this unrest continues, we're in World War III. In the first century, you're thinking, man, if the Pax Romana disseminates, we're in, I don't know, they might say World War I, but whatever they'd say.
Now I'm thinking of like global politics in terms of a red horse. Is there something significant to the colors before we continue?
I mean, yes. And I mean, nobody knows exactly what. Okay. If you're one of those people who are like mapping Revelation to today's times, then all of a sudden like the red horse, that's Russia,
Sure.
I don't think most biblical scholars would map it that direction, but talking about things like blood imagery in the scriptures, or the different precious stones that are kind of toyed on later in different places, rubies and emeralds and red and greens, or the green horse, for example, this idea of this pale kind of, even today, like the emoji for throwing up is green. And this idea of like pestilence and crops failing and all that. Right. A lot of times it's connected to those colors, like this pale kind of greeny color. So there's something. I don't know if there's more you have to say on
no.
that, but there's something, and there's different ways people look at it, and including today where people are like, oh, this is 21st century geopolitical war, and so we've got Russian. I don't think they would say Ireland, but Ireland is green, for example.
Right. I've seen a lot of that like the color of the horses matching this flag or that flag, and it's just like, wow, like.
I mean, you never know. I don't remember if we talked about this on the podcast, but I remember one time the United States named a couple of nuclear warheads after Old Testament prophetic imagery. And I'm like, is that how this goes down? Is that like countries start naming their bombs after words in Revelation, and then it's like literally happening?
Right.
So who knows how it's going to work?
Because I know those colors, red, black, green, and white are the colors of a lot of Middle Eastern countries, which has been like an eye-opening thing of like, whoa, like, is there something going on within this area?
I don't know. So this is the birthplace where these images come from.
Right.
You could also take it from a literature standpoint, and these different colors are archetypal colors that mean things, right? Green is life a lot of times. Red is blood, violence a lot of times. White is victory. Purple, we know in those days, is royalty and robes. And so there's a lot of ways you can take it.
Yeah. Well, let's continue to the third seal, because those two are pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, that was easy. Okay, we got this victorious rider. Awesome victory's coming. Oh no, but it's violence. What does that mean?
We're 2 for 2. So let's pop open a third seal here. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. What? A lot of terms that maybe we're not familiar with coming from the first century. First of all, the idea of a scale, like what is going on with this scale happening? And then it sounds like the voice among the 4 living creatures. I don't know if that's like the voice on the throne or what's going on, but he's saying 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley, do not damage the oil and the wine. What is going on with this particular statement?
Yeah, we take it at a high level or a low level. At a high level, we say, okay, he's talking about massive economic disruption and inflation. And so this idea that like, hey, you're going to, I don't know how much a person makes, that's listening, how much you make in a day, but imagine like you take your day's wage, you go to the store and you could, you buy like a pound of wheat or a pound, 6, it's like, that's not good. Like we're in a season of inflation. And so we start to see some of these themes emerging that, okay, when the world starts falling apart, we see violence, unrest, political turmoil, war between nations. We see massive inflation, environmental or economic disruption. And now we start thinking like, oh my gosh, he's talking about like today. It's like we just talked about a bunch of international crises. We're living in a season of great inflation. We've seen that coming out of COVID and all of the economic stuff that's happening and the pressures, trade embargoes, ports shutting down. Oh no, we're in the end times. And so part of that I think tells us not necessarily we're in the end times, but tells us that what they're describing is what happens when the world starts aching, groaning, falling apart is all these systems fall apart, the peacemaking systems, the commerce and economic systems. And that even this juxtaposition with this horse, this white horse, maybe the white horse is the Antichrist bringing evil, but it's almost like, hey, if it is representing a type of Christ bringing judgment and good to the world, it's like, hey, the end is coming, but through fury and wrath. And so, now we've seen economic forces. And then too, I've seen people make arguments that, okay, maybe he's talking about a specific time in human history where this is the economic scales, that this is how much barley costs, this is how much wheat costs, but then oil and wine costs stayed good. And no one's been able to find a season in the world where that exact combination has happened. So like, well, it hasn't happened yet. I feel like that's a little too granular. I think he's really just talking about when the end comes, we're going to see massive economic upheaval in addition to violence, bloodshed, and nation against nation.
Some of the research on like the first century income, I suppose, says that it's about half. So like, you would pay like a day's wages might be half, and now everything is inflated to 2 pounds and 6 pounds versus like 1 pound of wheat and 3 pounds of barley. So it's almost like inflation times 2, which is pretty crazy. Do not damage the oil, the wine. Again, we're talking about like viticultural communities that are like based on wine and oil. And there's just a lot of economic terms here that maybe we're unfamiliar with, but.
And this is, so that is 100% inflation.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, it is probably worth pointing out all of those goods are durable goods. So like
Right.
oil, wine are designed to be
last
to last a long
yeah.
time. Wheat, barley, these are grains that, if you have like a disaster preparedness kit, you might have some like barley in it or something, like these dried grains in it. So he's not talking about meat. He's not talking about perishables. So it's a season where people are stocking up, it sounds like, on these imperishable supplies, and everything costs twice as much as they should. I mean, this reminds us of like stocking up on toilet paper during COVID and everything costs double, So it's like, again, I'm not saying this is talking about the COVID season, but it is like talking about a season of huge like world trauma that's causing not just political and violence, but economic unrest as well.
Yeah. And you look at some of the first century history again, Domitian keeps coming up because he has an edict of, hey, there's a famine going on, and he starts to try to control the economy. So I've got a quote here. Following a severe winter, there was a serious famine in Asia Minor, causing the price of grain to soar, and the inhabitants of Pisidian Antioch had responded to the crisis by hoarding. The legate ordered all colonists and residents of Antioch to report within 30 days the quantity of grain they possessed and the amount needed to support each household for that year and the next planting. Excess grain had to be sold to the grain merchants at not more than 1 denarius per modius, double the pre-famine price, which was 8 per modius. I don't know what that means.
100% inflation. Well, that's, we talked a little bit last week on the podcast when we were kind of wrestling with different views of Revelation. There's kind of this futurist versus preterist thing that we didn't talk too much about it. But if you believe that Revelation was written to predict the events of the first century, then you're like, well, he's just talking about the reign of Domitian. He's the one on the white horse, and this is the violence, the Pax Romana going out the door. We see the economic thing almost to the T. If you're a futurist, you're like, no. What John's doing and Jesus is doing is here saying, hey, remember when Domitian reigned and all of that stuff like fell apart? It's going to be like that, but at a global level and the end times. And so either this is forecasting the reign of Domitian or kind of looking back at the reign of Domitian and saying, or something like it, and saying, just like it was then, it's going to be like that again, but at a greater level.
So we have this white horse coming in looking like Jesus.
So do you think that's Domitian on the white horse?
I have no idea. All I know is I think the important thing is it looks an awful lot like Jesus coming out of Revelation 19, verse 12, I believe that is. And then you have the red horse bringing in a lot of fighting, uplifting the reign of peace. And then you have this economic struggle. The fourth seal comes in. We see the fourth seal being broken in verse 7 here. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Man, the earth. What is going on with this pale horse rider?
I mean, I think of different times in human history. I think about the bubonic plague. I don't know what percentage of the world population died. The Spanish flu. I think about COVID-19 and the fears surrounding those things, that like there are these like global events where a percentage of the world's population dies. I think I remember the beginning of shelter in place in 2020. That was the fear. Is this another one of those great pandemics where, are 25% of the humans on the planet going to die in the next 3 months was what people were wrestling with in that time. And it's not just because it's in Revelation. It's because there have been these global events like those plagues I mentioned from the church history and from the history of the world, where through these various means, whether it's violence, pestilence, the sword, disease,
wild beasts,
that one is like, and again, that's kind of back to the red horse. Something is being removed that's causing craziness to happen. It's like, in our imagination, this is where we design like zombie movies and post-apocalyptic movies. It's like, that's the stuff that happens. It's like some great thing happened and now like the animals are attacking the humans and the zombies are attacking the humans. And it's like, something's been removed. And so we get a little bit of a glimpse of the idea that when the Spirit of God is removed from the earth, all hell breaks loose. We get a glimpse of that even right here where, some of these things, maybe it's a great plague, but then what's up with the animals? And it's like something more global and cataclysmic is happening where maybe it's because our houses are, falling apart and we have nowhere to live. And now we're living and we're prey to the animals. I don't know, but it's describing a terrible season.
So this one's unique that we're given its rider. So we have the name
Ooh.
death and Hades. And that pairing comes up 4 different times. So what do we know about death and Hades? This seems like a very first century type of motif going on.
I mean, when you said death and Hades, I was almost picturing a bigger picture of Revelation as a whole, where it's like we've got this at the end of time, a second death is going to happen, and then Hades is going to be the lake of fire is where Satan and his angels are going, and then people are going into this second death in Hades. And so I almost felt like when I was reading it here, it's like we're getting a glimpse that as these seals are being opened, these horses or almost these beasts of Revelation are being unleashed on the world. And now it's almost like hell is crawling out of its hole and coming to take us down. But I'm wondering, when you ask the question, is there some like Greek thing or biblical thing that you see?
Just mythology, just trying to figure out what exactly would have gone through the first century audience. And because I know Hades gets mentioned. I know there's another one like hell, not necessarily Hades, because Hades was like the realm of the dead. There's
like Sheol, Tartarus.
Tartarus is the one that's like ultimate hell, and then Hades was like the realm of the dead. And so I love that imagery of just like the realm of the dead following death, on its horse. Wow, that's really powerful.
Well, it feels like too, like in the imagery, it almost like even today, it's like, it comes from underground, like the tombs. Right. So as you're reading this now, I almost picture like as these seals are being snapped off of this scroll, it's like the earth is opening up and all of this stuff that's been restrained, like these seals were restrained in the scroll, that God was holding back his wrath or holding back even sin and evil. And by his own hand, he's almost taking his hand off and saying like, I'm going to let sin and evil run rampant. And now it's coming out of these holes to take down the human race, which reminds us, we'll talk about this later in the chapter, of just the long suffering nature of God, who has been holding back evil for so long. And now there's a glimpse where God's like releasing his grip on holding back evil, and evil is coming after us.
So let's take a pause right here, because if you notice the sequence, there's 4 horses, or 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
So why the imagery of 4 here? Because it seems like, we get image of 4 horsemen, and then the 5th, 6th, and 7th seal are dramatically different. So before we get into that, what is the significance, is there any, of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse?
I mean, it does map onto the 4 living creatures of the throne room of God. And I think, is each of those seals popped by one of the 4 living creatures?
It's one of the 4 living creatures says, "Come."
Oh yeah. And so there's some kind of connection there, right? So God has his attendants, and then there's almost this mirroring effect on earth, but instead of being agents of good and worship, like the 4 living creatures, they're agents of evil, sin, death, and destruction. So it's kind of interesting. It's like either it's like a mirror, or it's like good is beckoning evil, or it's like, I mean, you can say this is an extension of the wrath of God, and so this is God's wrath emerging on the earth. But yeah, that's the connection that I saw, was it's almost this counterpoint to these living creatures. I didn't like geek out on it to see like, okay, which creature opened which scroll, and is it connected? Is the beast one when the beasts of the fields come out?
Yeah, I have no idea. It just says one of the beasts.
Okay.
And so, I know a lot of people will point out the connection to Zechariah here as well. Zechariah chapter 1, Zechariah chapter 6, and they kind of work together. And these horses in the Zechariah scene are there to patrol the earth. It doesn't really explain too much of what's going on, but except that they're sent out to patrol what's going on in the earth. So I wonder if there's a connection there, and just some different imagery. So now we've hit Ezekiel, we've hit Isaiah, Zechariah.
I mean, and I keep thinking about the movie Elf, like the 4 horsemen of Central Park. Like, I mean, obviously a callback to Revelation, but they're patrolling Central Park, these 4 horsemen, So it's actually a biblical concept.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is where it came from. So if you're wondering, let's go to seal 5. Seal 5's dramatically different. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. What an odd response. You're saying, how long? I died for my faith. Hey, here's a white robe. Wait a little longer, because there's going to be many more. What an odd thing to say. So what do you think's going on in this response is it the one who's on the throne? They call out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord? So they're asking the sovereign Lord, and then they're given this robe, they're given this commission to wait a little longer until the full number of fellow brothers and sisters are killed.
Wow. As I was studying it, what I was thinking was reading through the first four scrolls and the four horsemen of the apocalypse and all the chaos. And you and I have been wrestling about this even right now on air. Is the justification for all that? Like why, how can a good God be releasing or even being allowed to be released all of this chaos and turmoil and terrible things on the planet? And one of the first answers to that question is in the fifth scroll, where it's from underneath the altar where the blood would be spilt. There's these martyrs who are crying out, how long, O Lord? And we're reminded that for all of human history, right? Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the history of the world. There's more martyrs from the Christian religion than any other religion. It's the most persecuted religion today in the world, and people are dying every day for their faith. And part of the reason that this vengeance, this justice, this response needs to happen is because there's been so much gross injustice poured out in this world. Or whether we're talking about people who die and suffer needlessly at the hands of oppressors, or we talk about Christian martyrs who die because of their faith. Man, this world is groaning for redemption. When will judgment come? If you've ever experienced something terrible in your own life, you're thinking, when is God going to do something? And so the first thing I think when I read about scroll 5 is like, oh, this is God doing something. This is to everyone who's ever cried out, God, when are you going to show up and avenge the enemies of your people or avenge the perpetrators of the human race? God is saying, well, here it is. This is what I've been waiting for. And yet the part of the turn here is fascinating. It's not God saying, I've had enough, I'm going to kill them all. God says, well, hold on a little bit longer because there's more like you who need to die before the end comes. And we get a little bit of this like heart-wrenching glimpse that
it's jarring.
The end is not going to come until the fullness of martyrdom is complete. In the same way that Paul talks about when he's suffering, he says, I consider it joy in my suffering because somehow I get to fill up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. And we don't believe that Jesus didn't suffer enough on the cross, but we do believe that Jesus created a certain amount of suffering that would happen among his people before the end would come. And Paul's like, hey, I get to play a part in that because Christ will not come back until his people have suffered to the extent that he has designed. And so there's just on one hand, it's a nice answer that, okay, well, justice is coming. But on the other hand, it's like new questions. Wait, what? Like more martyrs have to come, and this is part of God's plan. And you know, we see things like in the early church where they'd say the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That martyrdom is one of the things that has allowed Christianity to become the biggest religion in the world, because martyrs somehow fuel the church. But martyrs look like Jesus, who was the ultimate martyr of the Christian faith. But it's not completely satisfying, but it's a bit of an answer that this judgment is coming to the world because of martyrdom, but at the same time, this judgment is going to create more martyrdom, and wait a little longer. And this robe in white is saying, hey, you are safe. You're spared from this wrath. You're in this safe place now. But just keep waiting. Ultimate judgment and justice is coming at the end of this thing.
I'm glad you mentioned the white robe and sort of what that means. I know we've been talking about that in different imagery throughout this book up to this point. You see the question, how long? You're always like instantly reminded of like the Psalms that are always asking that question. David is, or whoever's writing the Psalm is always asking, how long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? The imprecatory Psalms. The one I wanted to ask that you touched on a little bit, under the altar. Is there something significant about these souls lying under this altar that have been slain? Yeah,
I think so. It's just in the geography of the temple and this imagery here, like when a sacrifice was pulled up on the altar and then its throat was cut and the blood was poured out, that's where the blood would be under the altar. And so I do think there's part of it, like they are the sacrifice of the church. They are like martyrs are pleasing to God, even though it's terrible and their death is unjust and will be judged, and justice will come against the oppressors. There's something where it's like, man, there's these people have sacrificed their life for the gospel, and they're crying out in this moment. And part of me thinks, are they crying out because they're thinking like, enough is enough. Stop this death and pestilence and these things and bring forth your kingdom. But I think sometimes we have a pretty sanitary view of religion, and because we live in the West where we don't we aren't personally martyred for our faith. But I wonder how you'd read this if you're living in Eritrea today or something, or in Saudi Arabia or something, and experiencing intense suffering because you're a believer and you're being beheaded, these different types of things that happen. If you would read this and be like, yes, that's the question I ask all the time.
Yeah. It makes me think of that Leviticus 17 passage of like the life being in the blood. And yeah, we would say that Jesus has spilled his own blood to be the ultimate sacrifice. But I think of like the impact of a life of a martyr, and like just the amount that the amount of influence of spread. We always are talking about like just the faithfulness of these people and how much it's truly their sacrifice has like leaned into, or not leaned into, but like been an influence on the church. I think that's so powerful to think about how their blood hasn't been wasted. It's not in vain. Like it's just like it's right there at the centerpiece, one of the centerpieces of temple, the heavenly temple at the altar. So,
and we made the argument a few weeks ago that there seem to be no humans in that room, assuming the elders are not human beings. And now the martyrs are the only human beings in that throne room, are the ones who are kept in that place until justice comes.
Well, we made it through 5. We got our 6th one here. Yeah, 2 left. You would think it's short, but it's not. Verse 12, I watched as he opened the 6th seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth, as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. This language sounds a little bit familiar if you're in the Old Testament, looking at the day of the Lord coming. What is going on with a lot of this imagery here? And yeah, help us understand the 6th seal.
Yeah, the first 4, when we're talking about the different things that come upon planet Earth, you almost picture it's like these localized like landmines or something, that like the Earth is being destroyed from on top of itself. Now that we're here on the 6th seal, it almost feels like, this reminds me a lot of Genesis 1 and 2, like it's an undoing of creation. The heavenly hosts are falling from the skies. It's like the earth is melting like a painting you would see, you're right, like a Dali painting or something. It's like the earth is melting here. It's got to be a terrifying image where you're like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the end. It's not the end, spoiler alert. But it is like, okay, it's not just things are getting bad here on planet Earth. This is a global cataclysmic, like earth shaking, heaven's celestial body melting thing that's happening here.
And I love how this seal in particular is connected to a lot of the Old Testament imagery that we see in the final days of judgment, whether it's Joel 2:31, the sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood. Isaiah 13, for the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark as it's at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Isaiah 34, all the hosts of heaven shall rot away, and the skies will roll up like a scroll. And just all these different cosmic imagery that you mentioned in Genesis 1 happening. Do you think it's significant that a lot of this image in the 6th seal has a lot of Old Testament imagery, whereas I don't know how much Old Testament imagery influences the first 5?
I did see some things on a pairing between the creation account in Genesis 1 and the seals here, where it almost feels like an undoing, especially when you see the 7th and there's this day of rest almost. You kind of see these celestial bodies on the 6th seal kind of falling from the skies that were placed in the skies to govern the skies. It's like everything is falling apart. We talked about like, why are we talking about wild beasts? It's like, well, maybe that maps to Genesis 1 where we're talking about the beasts of the field. And
right.
We're talking about grain. We're talking about things that grow from the earth and come out of the earth. We're talking about mountains and islands that have popped up from the seas. So it's almost like we're seeing a bit of the opposite of what we see in creation, where everything is taking from this ball of mud and separated out, and things pop up and out. Now it's well organized and governed. And here in Revelation, as these 6 seals, it's almost the undoing of the 6 days of creation. And now by the 6th one, even the star and the sun and the moon are falling from the sky, and the oceans are coming back up again. And it's like everything's turning back into a mess once again before the silence of God rested after his decreation on the 6 seals.
Yeah, I guess we can piggyback off that conversation because now we've popped open 6 different. We didn't pop them open. The lamb
popped them open
with whatever thumb or,
We don't know how he did it. We don't know how. And I've heard 2 interpretations. I've heard that it's like the seal is like a scroll. It is a scroll, but has like 7 bands on it. I've also heard that it, like as you open it, there's another seal, then another seal, then another seal, then another seal, then another seal. So to open it fully, you got to open all 7. I kind of go with the 7 rings in a row thing.
Yeah.
Just like this is super secure, but he's opening this thing up. And it's like, if this is what the 7 seals are like, what's going to happen when he reads the words on this scroll? Because as much as this just sounded like the decreation of the earth, it's not. That was just seals. The scroll has not yet been read.
Right. And so we'll pause here because the text also takes a pause right here because it
for
doesn't.
Like a whole chapter, right?
For a whole chapter. It doesn't talk about the 7th seal. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the sequence of seals 1 to 6 because you just talked about how if you flip it on its head, it sort of decreates and has that imagery of anti-Genesis 1. Is there anything else that we should see or we should look at in terms of why these seals were placed in the order that they were?
I'll let you answer that in a moment because I think you might have a cooler answer than I'm about to say. But one thing that I was thinking as you were reading them is it's interesting how it scales up throughout the book, where it's like a certain percentage of the world dies when this seal is opened. Later, it's like, oh, that's a bigger percentage, right? So this is like a micro version of what's going to happen with maybe the bowls. But what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of relationship that happens, and a lot of people have interpreted the seals and the trumpets and the bowls as being sort of like this cyclical thing that you're just like seeing from a different angle, different perspectives. And so that is one way to interpret it. When I was studying this, and we obviously do independent study because we're just not like in a room looking at Revelation.
Yes, like, what did you read? Yeah.
Although that would be really fun. I was just struck by how like in alignment it is with Matthew 24 and Jesus's words given. We don't have a lot of Jesus speaking on these events except for that it's coming. And the one time he's asked, it just seems really odd that this Matthew 24 passage lines pretty close to what's going on in these seals. And so Matthew 24, it talks about, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. And so seal number 1 was that rider on the white horse that could be emulating the Christ. The red horse rider that brought war essentially and brought fighting. You will hear wars and rumors of wars. The black horse rider that brought economic peril. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. The pale horse rider that brings in death and Hades following him. With sword, pestilence, famine, beasts of the earth. There will be famines, earthquakes. This will be the birth pains of everything. The tribulation, they'll put you up to death. But it only aligns up to that point.
Oh, I was going to say, then what does it say?
Because in 5, or seal 5, where the martyrs come in, it talks about betraying one another, hating one another, false prophets will rise, the gospel of the kingdom being preached throughout the whole world, the abomination of desolation, all these different things that feel kind of disjointed happen here. But then like seal 6 comes in and it's like trippy how Jesus aligns this with what's happening in Revelation. Because it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of heaven will be shaken. So it seems like somebody has Jesus's words in mind. Likely the Apostle John here.
I mean, or if John's just experiencing this, he's probably hearing Jesus's words while he's seeing these images, thinking like, "This is what he was talking about." And I think the Matthew 25 passages ends with, "And then the end will come."
Yeah,
is it true?
24, Matthew 24.
Yeah,
because Matthew 25 is all the parables about we should wait well.
Yeah, and so I think like while you're watching this and you're seeing all this crazy thing, you're like, "Is this the end?" But the whole time you're thinking, "And then the end will come," right? Which is what we keep talking about. Like, this is not the end. This is the beginning of the end. So even the 6th scroll that feels like the end, and then the end will come. Right. And there's a little bit of an overlap because, and we'll talk about the 7th scroll and the first trumpet seem to overlap in some way. But it feels like this was just stage 1.
Yeah, it's just him popping the seals off. And I think, if that's true and they lined up with the Matthew 24, then I think like the cry of the martyrs just becomes like, hey, this is a situation we're seeing. It's like a lot of different craziness. And this is why the martyrs are crying out. Like, how long, oh Lord, how long does this all have to go down? please shorten the days, which Jesus says that he does.
Well, and there's compassion there. There's compassion in the next chapter too, when we see like the 144,000 sealed.
Right.
This idea that answers the other question, like what is happening here? It's like, well, God's not going to bring the total end until everyone that needs to be saved is saved. So It's like there's a certain number of suffering that needs to happen before the world ends. There's a certain number of salvation that needs to happen before the world ends. And God is long suffering on both accounts. And so even though both of those are like gulp worthy, at the same time, it's God is saying, I'm holding back the end because there's more that needs to happen with my people before I'll let this world be destroyed.
Well, speaking of compassion and holding back, we get this break between seal 6 and seal 7. And it starts with verse 15, this like discussion on how are the people of the earth responding? How are non-Christians responding? It says, then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, they hid in caves.
Which is, that's what Jesus talks about in Matthew 25, right? Is like when the abomination of desolation comes, flee to the hills, right? Go hide in the caves.
So they hid in caves. They hid among the rocks.
And this is like the kings of the earth, right? So this is like any movie where it's like, where's the president? He's in a bunker somewhere because like nuclear war is coming to America. Like this is like a big deal.
They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? What stands out to you the most about this little break here, talking about how the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, everybody, both slave and free, are responding to these 6 seals?
I think what strikes me on one hand is how portable it is. You think of when any enemy is on its run, on the run, this is what they go into hiding, and so you think of times that even in our country, there's been the targeted death of world leaders, like in Osama bin Laden character. It's like he's hiding in a spider hole and we come and find him. We think of that image of, the president and the vice president hiding in a bunker because nuclear war is coming. But what strikes me in this is that when they are saying, hey, just take our lives now, because this is not going to be good, they also are explicitly recognizing that the God that we worship is the one who's bringing forth the wrath. And so they're not saying like, oh no, this nuclear war is terrible. We're all going to die. I don't want to face it. You can see that again in the text. It's like they're talking about the one who sits on the throne. They're talking about our God. And so somehow
and the Lamb
in this ultimate thing, like they are attributing this wrath to the one true God. And these kings in the mind of John are not believers. Like there were no believing kings in John's day. And yet in this imagery, they know that Jesus Christ is the one who is the Lamb and he is the one who's bringing this wrath. So it's different than just what the world has experienced before.
Yeah. And going back to a first century reading, there was this idea of prodigies, Roman prodigies, basically like signs of divine anger. So they had this idea that if cosmically things were unfolding, like it's a sign that somebody is angry. And I love that they identify it is him who sits on the throne. It is the Lamb. And here's a quote. Flavius Josephus, one of the first century historians that people point out, described in the manner of Roman historians of his day a number of unusual signs that he understood as divine warnings of the imminent destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, including a comet that lasted a year, a light that shone around the altar at midnight, a cow intended for sacrifice that gave birth to a lamb, a very heavy gate of the temple court that opened of its own accord, an appearance of chariots and armed soldiers in the sky, and a voice that was heard to say, "We are departing from here." Wow. Flavius Josephus, man. A historian.
I know. Well, and it's interesting too. So in the Roman Empire, and every empire, there's always a theological construct for every empire on planet Earth. And at that time in the Roman Empire, if you went to school, you studied the Greek, the Roman gods. The idea was if the gods were angry, you had to make them propitious, like satisfy the god's wrath. And they did that through violence. And so that's why until like the 4th century, the Roman Empire would have acts of violence that just kept their gods at bay. So that whether it's gladiatorial games or just human sacrifice, or there's even a case where they were losing a war. And so or maybe it was a natural disaster, I can't remember, but they had all of the army like dig Like there was supposedly a big chasm in the earth, like an earthquake opened up a big chasm, and all the army jumped into and gave up their own lives, and that closed the chasm, and the gods were happy. So it's the idea that like violence is going to satisfy the wrath of God. And it's interesting, like in the Christian religion, God has been made propitious by the death of his own son. There's no human sacrifice of our own that needs to happen. The blood of bulls and goats does not take away sin. We don't need to cut ourselves to satisfy God. He is satisfied eternally because of the obedience of his son, Jesus. And that's just such a stark contrast to these other empires. They're like, the gods are angry. What should we do? With us, it's like, if our God is angry, there's nothing you can do. Like he's coming for the world. Most of the time that he is holding things back at bay, he is long suffering and allowing his will or people to come to him and all these things. But very different than a Roman worldview.
Yeah. So let's just paint the picture really quick as we continue here. We popped open 6 different seals.
There's one left.
We've heard the response of these kings, and they're run into the hills, they're run into the caves. You can look at Isaiah 2 and Hosea 10 for some of those images of people run into caves, run into hills. And they ask this really important question in verse 17, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? Which leads directly to chapter 7. So in chapter 7, it begins with John seeing something. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or any tree. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea, do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. What is going on with the 4 corners, these angels coming up from the east? And then we have this seal that I guess is not the seal on the scroll, but a seal now on people's foreheads. So what's going on? Help us paint the picture here of what's about to happen.
Well, part of it is, in the same way that the martyrs kind of gave a little bit of like, what's the justification of this happening? There's a bit of it. We're saying, God is not ultimately going to bring forth the fullness of the end until the fullness of his people come to faith in him. So this idea of God's long-suffering nature comes out here. Sealing people with his sign. It's interesting. A lot of times people are all consumed with the Antichrist and 666 and the number on your forehead. And is it my like wearable watch, or is it, what is it that's the sign? It's like, this is really just basic biblical imagery that, I mean, I'm sure you've got queued up some Old Testament prophecy about sealing people on their forehead. But God is sealing people. It's this image that like you are his. He's put his mark on you. It's almost like if you're his cattle, he's branded you, but in a good way. And he is not going to bring forth the fullness of his wrath until he has rescued everyone. And so it's, again, imagine a military operation. We've got to come and decimate this city, but we're not going to drop any of these bombs until every American citizen has been pulled from this place. And once the last one has come and we've marked them and pulled them out and brought them to safety, then the end will come. We get a bit of that imagery of like, don't worry, God's not going to destroy the righteous with the wicked, which is a question that comes up a lot in the Old Testament, especially in Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm thinking about. He's going to extract the righteous and then destroy the civilization.
Well, here's what I got queued.
Yeah, there we go.
Ezekiel 9. I know you mentioned it last podcast for people to get ready. Ezekiel 9 is where Ezekiel is looking at the situation in Jerusalem, and a couple angels come to the Lord, and the Lord tells one of the angels to pass through the city of Jerusalem, pass through the temple, and put this seal on the people that are wailing over the state of Israel in this moment, the abominations that have come and taken over the temple. And those are the people that get spared from the second angel that comes in that brings total destruction.
And what does that story remind you of?
What does it remind me of? It reminds me of this right now.
When you were talking about that, I was thinking about the Passover, like in Egypt, where it's like, and it's not 2 angels, but it's the angel of destruction is about to come over the city. Totally. But first, the people put the mark on their doorposts, which mark out this is a believing house, which represents the blood of Christ later. Mm-hmm. I would ask you this question then. If God were to seal his people with a sign that prevented them from God's wrath, what would the seal be that God puts on his people?
It's a great question. I was going to ask you that. Man, what exactly is the seal? Because I know there's been a lot of debates about like, what is the seal? Again, if we're going through our filter of how to answer these questions about Revelation, you would then go to I mean, I immediately am drawn to the first century context and like, what is it that was going on? And so putting a mark or brand on I mean, it's still today. Like, it's just like demeaning in a little bit. It's like ownership, and it's a barbarian custom in the first century. It's a punishment, a mark of disgrace, mark of ownership in the Roman Empire that had slavery rampant in it, sacrificial rite in some cults. And then the final one here, we see that in the earliest Christians, the earliest disciples called baptism a seal. And we see language of the seal of the Holy Spirit. And so what do you think about, baptism being in play here, or just the Spirit in general being in play?
The Spirit is the first thing I thought about. I thought of Ephesians 1:13 that says, in him also you were sealed with the promised Holy Spirit when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, when you believed. Right. So this idea that the seal is this promise of God's inheritance, that we have received this thing that marks us out for his people. It's an irrevocable seal. I haven't looked, the research team can look up the Greek here, but is the seal used here the same as the word for the seal that's on the scrolls? Because that's just another cool little juxtaposition.
Oh man, how many Greek words can there be for seal?
I know, it's like we got these living creatures begatting these like 4 horses. We got the 7 seals begatting the seals on God's people. But now they're being sealed with this Spirit, which is, this again, the seal that's on the scrolls, we're protecting and holding it fast until it reached its intended audience. The seal of the Spirit is holding us, protecting us, keeping us fast until we are delivered to our final place in the eternal kingdom.
You guys are quick out there. The research department got back.
They got back so fast.
Sophagizo. It is the same word.
The same word. The seal. The 7 seals. And then the 144,000 seals.
Not the seals that swim in the ocean.
No, not those seals. Not those seals.
Different Greek word, I suppose.
I'm assuming it is.
Okay. All that being said, we get to one of the most controversial texts in all of this section, which we'll spend a little time on. In verse 4, chapter 7, I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. From the tribe of, and then it fills in 12 different tribes, and it says 12,000 were sealed for each of the 12 tribes. And the order is very important too. So we'll say it's Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Now, at first glance, you might be thinking,
the 12 tribes of Israel.
Sweet. Let's move on. But this has been the center of so much debate. Who are the 144,000? And what is going on with this specific list? Because you look at all the lists listed in Scripture, there's some in Numbers, there's some in Ezekiel, there's some in Genesis. This is a list that nobody's seen before in terms of the order, right? There's some little tweaks happening here and there. And so take us deeper into the 144,000 conversation, because I know we've been going a long time already. So 144,000.
144,000. Let's just start at the basic level. That's a number that represents fullness. So 12 is a number of completion. Right? 12. We've talked about this in the throne room of the 12 elders or 24 elders. Mm-hmm. So like 12 apostles, 12 tribes, right? 12 times 1,000, or so 144,000. 12 times 12 times 1,000. So it's this number of fullness, completion, right? Which goes to that symbolism that the end's not going to come until the fullness of those who need to turn in faith to God are going to come in faith to God. One question that comes up is, well, these aren't the normal 12 tribes of Israel, right? There's some replacements in here. And it's interesting. It maps on, I think, to the end of Revelation that describes the different gates of the city, kind of north, south, east, west, and kind of goes through that line in that same order. And so, because these is not the same 12 tribes in birth order that we see in the Old Testament. And so there's a bit of symbolism going on here. The big question is, who are these people? Is it literally the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So Jewish people who come to faith, like racially Jewish people. And so if you're like we'll throw out another theological word, dispensational camp, that's talking about, okay, like we talked about on the podcast last week, the church has been raptured. They're gone. There's no believers. Who's going to be the ones who hold on to God's truth? Oh, it's going to be the Jewish people who finally recognize Jesus as their Messiah, and the fullness of Jews from every one of the 12 tribes are going to be saved. That's one argument. The other would say, probably because it's a different rapture theology or whatever, or maybe just a different, covenant theology with not a literal future for physical Israel, would say, no, this just represents, this is a symbolic thing. It's an apocalyptic book. God is merely saying, I still have people on this earth, and I am going to make sure that the fullness of them are sealed with the Holy Spirit before I come back, from every tongue, tribe, and nation. 12 times 1,000 from every tribe, right? That kind of thing. And so either just symbolizes the fullness of those turning to Christ, or some would say, actually, there's a mass repentance that happens in the nation of Israel, which, go down the rabbit hole, that is probably a big part of the history that the Christian church in America has with the nation of Israel today, is this idea that like God has a future for these people. They're so close. They just need to turn to Jesus, and they will at the end times. We've got to help preserve the nation of Israel. And so even what you believe about Revelation kind of moves into your geopolitical stance on nations of this world. So if you ever wonder, man, why are so many Christians so passionate about the nation of Israel and like an Israeli-Palestinian conflict or war? Some of it goes back to this, that there are a lot of Christians who believe that God still has a future for these folks, and they're going to come to their Messiah. We need to keep their land. We need to make sure that temple real estate is ready for the events that happen in Revelation. And they themselves are going to turn to faith. They need to hear about Jesus, their Messiah, because he is their Messiah primarily. I've even heard Christians go so far in scholastic settings to say that the church, us Gentiles, is just a parenthesis on God's plan, that his whole plan is for Israel to be saved, and they turned away from him when Jesus came. And so he took a couple thousand years and like adopted us into his family, but eventually he's going to go back to his real family and not like leave us. But we were kind of like a side plan, and now he's going back to his real plan. So a lot of things to say about this, but two major interpretations: either the fullness of believers coming to faith, or all of a sudden there's a mass conversion for Jewish people who recognize for the first time finally that Jesus is in fact their true Messiah.
If you're interested to go deeper on some more perspectives, we would refer to you back to our conversation on the rapture, because I think a lot of that stems into this conversation of like, who do you actually believe is in this situation? Because we're in the midst of the 6th and 7th seal right now. And a lot of people might say, well, the church is not there, so it has to be Israel.
It can't be the church.
Yeah. But if you believe the church is there, then all of a sudden that door and that option
why
opens
instead of all
for
these
you.
Jewish people getting saved, what about the church? Yeah.
Right. And they might say, hey, that's why the tribe of Judah is listed first, because it's like symbolic of, hey, Jesus is leading the charge, and everybody under Jesus is now referred to in this list. Some other changes. We hardly ever see Levi listed in the list. Joseph and Ephraim get switched out. And then, sorry, Dan.
Dan's gone, I know.
Dan's gone. So
we get like a little double portion for Joseph there. I mean, and again, it maps on, there's, we've referred to Alistair Roberts' commentary on Revelation on YouTube, which you're welcome to check out since you might already be on YouTube right now. And he actually kind of talks about the whole reason for these specific 12 and where you see that in Revelation and other places. So if you want to geek out on why these 12 tribes, check out Alistair's
What's
thing.
the Spark Notes summary?
I think he was mostly mapping it to geography. So talking about saying like, wait, there's a birth order in Genesis. This isn't the birth order.
Right.
It's not the same players.
Right.
But when you do look at these different gates on the walls, which are, I don't remember if it's 144,000 stadia or whatever it is, but the 12 gates from north, south, east, and west, you can actually go around, I think it's clockwise, and they map onto these 12 tribes in order. And so you see that it's actually symbolic, connected with something. And I think he paired it with something else too in the Old Testament. I don't remember what it was, but saying more, it's more about talking about the fullness, right? So when we talk about the breadth of the city of God, how big it is, and the gates and how wide, and the square footage or square miles of the city, it's talking about these 12 gates that surround it, three on each side. And he walks through that list: north, south, east, west, or northeast, southwest, whatever it is.
So at the end of the rapture video, I asked this question, like, what is the one thing that you can unite different readers on this perspective? Is there anything that you see that like, hey, if you believe it's purely Israel, like this is what's going to be the result. If you believe it's the church, like, is there something that like can bring us together?
Yeah, I think because like you said, it depends on your rapture theology. So if you believe it's Israel, it's probably because you believe there is no church at that point, right. And they've been raptured. And so really what we see here is that the end is coming, but God is holding back the fullness of his wrath because he is going to save the fullness of those who are intended for salvation.
Yeah.
And so, if you're reading this and you're thinking like Abraham, when he hears about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, you would go to God and say, are you truly going to destroy the righteous with the wicked? What if X amount of righteous people are still in the city? Will you still bring forth your destruction? And God will say, hey, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy the city. And God's like, hey, I'm actually not going to destroy the city until the fullness of those who are mine are gathered unto myself. And so when I do bring about my final judgment and I bring my wrath here on planet Earth, I'm not going to be destroying any people who are mine. They are safe from my wrath, either through rapture or they're safe from my wrath because I've sealed them with this spirit. And somehow, we see that in Jesus talking about the end times where two are washing and one is, left behind. It's like God spared his person and destroyed the other.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that I've found comforting about this passage is like, regardless of where you land on who this is, I think the means of salvation is still the same. Like they have to come to faith in Jesus. And I think that is another uniting factor underneath this is like, regardless of where you believe the gospel is or who you believe this 144,000 is, it's a commission to share the gospel again. Mm-hmm. So, to avoid any more landmines, again, if you have more conversations or want to ask questions about anything more specific, we'd love to talk with you, have a conversation with you. But we got to keep going because we're almost to the end. We're almost to the end because right after this vision of the 144,000, in verse 9 of chapter 7, it says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. Now, before I end, I want to jump down to some later verses, verse 13, because we get some insight about who exactly this is. One of the elders asked me, the author John, these in white robes, who are they and where did they come from? And basically the answer is, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. Okay, so we have this multitude of people, and these people in white robes have come out of the great tribulation. Help us understand what John is seeing right after he saw this 144,000 collected and stamped and sealed on earth. He then sees a multitude.
Yeah, so it feels like he's fast forwarding to the end of the tribulation. And again, all this is so apocalyptic, you don't know, right? Because the other people who get white robes are the martyrs who are already dead in the same chapter,
right?
Or in the same section. So maybe it's a glimpse of, wow, like the tribulation is finally over and the martyrs are collected in full. Those who need to be saved are collected in full. We're all here. We did it. Yay, we survived the tribulation. We know this is not the end, but so it feels like a glimpse. It also feels kind of like that Hebrews great cloud of witnesses run the race. Like they have these palm branches, like the end is near, like we're crossing the finish line. Like, yes, we did it. It's over the tribulation. We survived it. God has brought us through. So it's a bit of a reprise celebration, but it's not the end. Yeah. We're only in like chapter 7 or whatever.
And that's the tricky thing about this is like, if you take the thing about Revelation, if you take this stance, then like it influences this stance and this stance and this stance. So it's really difficult to navigate. And yet I do feel like the victory of the Lamb, the victory of Jesus being found in Jesus at the end, like that's going to either, if you're in the church, you're going to be raptured and taken to him if in a pre-tribulation view. If you're a part of the church that stays during the tribulation, you're going to be sealed like we saw here. You're going to be protected in a very particular way. We're going to see how that plays out in the 5th trumpet, I believe. And if you're going to be in this great multitude. So like, I think again, the underlying themes of Revelation are the victory found in the Lamb. And I think that can really settle our arguments down. We don't have to get heated with each other.
That is where everyone agrees is at the finish line, is that Christ is victorious. He saves his people. No one's left behind for all eternity. We are sealed with his spirit and we join him in the kingdom.
And so we see, again, this book is a book of worship. And so this whole section that we've been talking about ends with a couple of different songs. And so it says that the people, that this great multitude that we're seeing in white robes, they're holding palm branches in their hands and they're singing. They cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." And it creates this like really cool domino effect where once they say that, it says in verse 11, all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures. They then fell down on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and honor and thanks and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen." And as I was imagining this, I was thinking like, perhaps you have the 24 elders and the four living creatures there, and then they kind of like turn around and they're like, "What was that? Oh man, amen. Yes, I love what they said." So what stands out to you about this song that not only are the four living creatures and the elders around the throne are singing, but like the ones in the white robes out of this great tribulation, they're singing?
Yeah, there's this on earth as it is in heaven concept throughout the scriptures. But so I'm thinking of in the throne room, when the Lamb comes, we see a very similar thing. There's the Lamb shows up, and then there's a song from the living elders. It's a new song. And then there's an echoing, right? We always see this kind of cascading effect, and all the angels come and they chime in. And so it almost feels like a recapitulation of that, like a recap here. But now it's these humans who've been saved who are praising the Lamb, and then the angelic being follows them. So kind of John was whisked in the throne room and saw kind of the archetype that everything on earth was built upon. And then he gets to see the future of planet Earth, and he sees it actually ultimately lands at a throne room worship service like he saw in heaven itself. And earth finally starts to look like heaven for the first time because the dross of sin and violence and wickedness has been burned off. And it feels like it could be the end of the book, but after the seals, there's the trumpets, then the bowls, then the end comes.
And it's crazy that this is all happening between the sixth seal and the seventh seal. Like we haven't been told about the seventh seal yet. And it says that these people in the white robes, therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water. And God will wipe away every tear from their eye. So we have this final, it seems like a poem. Therefore, all these things are happening. What stands out to you about this final sayings here in verses 15 to 17 about the God who will shelter them, will feed them, will give them this living water? What stands out to you about this shepherd of the Lamb?
Yeah, it is we're celebrating because these people are about to step foot on it into a new realm that is the eternal state where they're fed by God, they're cared for. Even that wipe every tear from their eyes doesn't mean every time they cry, God's going to wipe the tears away. It literally means God's going to remove their tear ducts because they're not a necessary part of the human body anymore. I don't know if I literally mean that, but like I'm sure there's still, you need tears for lubrication of your eyeballs.
Right.
But in terms of you're not going to need to cry anymore is the idea that like there's no need for these tear ducts anymore. And so we're about to enter into a new state, a new world, an eternal state that's different, that sin is eradicated. Everyone who's ever longed for the world to be made right, for sin to stop, for violence to cease, that world is coming, and we've made it to the end. We've persevered, and now we get to step foot on this new place where sin is vanquished. If we're watching a movie, we're thinking, but wait, Satan still exists? That's coming. But this is a great little moment to like celebrate, like a midpoint kind of thing.
Yeah, and it still feels like, this is what the Old Testament prophets were hoping for, having the shepherd from the line of David to rule over them in Ezekiel 34. Or they shall never hunger or thirst again, Isaiah 49. Micah 5, they will dwell securely with the Lord. Jesus being the shepherd found in John 10. All these different images just packed into this one statement that you can find in the Old Testament. And Isaiah 25:8 being a really important one. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. Feels like such a good ending. We've made it, but we still have that seventh seal.
The seventh seal.
And it doesn't come till chapter 8. So whoever invented chapters and verses, maybe they had this in mind. But we finally get to the seventh seal after what's called the interlude of what's going on in chapter 7. And it feels like a cliffhanger. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. It then goes on to describe another angel having this golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense together with the prayers of God's people went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumbling, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Where are we going with this? It feels like what we just talked about with the seven seals. It feels so climactic. Like it feels like this is the end of some sort of era. And yet we haven't been explained what's going on with the seventh seal. It feels like there's a pause in this scene where it's like time just stands still for about a half an hour. So what do you see is happening with this final seventh seal and where we're going to go from here?
Yeah, I actually don't see it as anticlimactic at all. About a year ago when we first started studying the book for this series, I listened to the entire book of Revelation in one sitting on audiobook, just went on a walk. And this was the most powerful moment in the entire book for me was
Really?
This idea that like it just goes silent in heaven for half an hour.
Huh.
When you think about the eternal singing and worship that we read about in chapter 4 or 5, wherever it was.
Yeah.
And now it's silent. And I do think the seventh seal is moving it along. It's like you've got this scroll, 6 of those security locks have been pried off. Mm-hmm. He cuts the last one and everyone just holds their breath for 30 minutes.
Right.
And all of a sudden now the angels start coming out in this incense and we see a parallel between heaven and earth that as this incense is thrown, like lightning and thunder is happening on the earth. It's like, and then the trumpet sounds and it's like this, he's ready to open the scroll. And so now it's kind of like an angelic chorus, like da, 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 like the king is about to speak. And we got 7 full trumpets of like the king is about to speak, but like it's the scroll is ready to be opened. It's time to announce the king is about to speak. But it's like, it's terrifying, exhilarating. And this is just, we can finally open the scroll. And so we're going to spend the next week just talking about these 7 trumpets that represent, hear ye, the king is about to read what's on the scroll. So it's like wow, that was just us unlocking the door. And it's like he opens the door or unlocks the final lock and then all of a sudden calls out, the door is about to be open and the king will walk through. And now we're going to spend seven doorbells ringing or something,
Yeah. And hopefully this has been an encouragement to you guys of just walking through this verse by verse, going through it detail by detail. Before we go, just one more question. Why do you think this is being played out so long? Why not just jump to the conclusion already? Like what's God's motivation for just slowly just popping open each seal and having there be like a pause in this moment?
The first thing that comes to my mind when you say that is it's a big world. Like we're talking about millions and millions of people. We're talking about millions and millions of square miles. And we're talking about who knows how long it takes for these things to happen. So part of it is this, God is starting to unfold his plan for the recreation of heaven and earth. And it starts by, we see this parallel every time a seal is cut, the world, like bombs start going off on planet earth. So it's, these things are happening, the beginning of the birth pains, like this is what's happening behind the scenes. God saves his people. Now it's time to pour out the wrath of God on the world, to bind Satan, the real enemy, throw him in prison. And there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And so, you go to a coronation ceremony for a king, it's probably gonna be a couple hours long. It's like the king of kings is going to read the greatest speech in the history of the world that's going to completely end the world and start it over. It's probably going to be quite a ceremony. So just feels like 7 trumpets instead of 1. It's like a whatever. What do you say, 24 gun salute or however many gun salute? It's like it's right. A big deal. So I just read it's a big deal and a lot is happening. It's a big world and he's recreating it all. In a sense, he's recreating the entire world in 21 chapters. That's crazy.
Right. Well, I hope that this idea of imagery in the Bible is standing out to you guys as listeners and viewers. And, hopefully that image of just popping open each seal and just chaos emerging behind that popping of the seal open is standing out to you. Because right now I'm imagining, okay, he's finally opened that seventh seal. Everyone's on edge of like, what's going to happen? He's going to unroll that thing. What's going to happen? And hopefully that sticks with you as we move forward into the next chapters of what is this seal going to contain. I'm excited to dive into it some more. Hopefully you can join us. And Pastor Danny, we made it.
We made it.
We made it past the seals onto the trumpets.
Trumpets start next. Come back next week.
Here we go. Dun, 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 dun.